D.W. Phillips is a producer and film director, attorney, and journalist. He's been involved in some extraordinary projects in Ukraine as a documentary filmmaker. And we're going to talk today about his journey, how he came to discover Ukraine, why he's there, why he's so involved in recording the terrible conflict that is unfolding, and what connection he has to Russia and Ukraine that has driven him to do this. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. If you enjoy the materials we create and, of course, our incredible guests, then please like and subscribe to help the channel grow and help new people discover the great speakers that we've got on the channel. Consider also becoming a patron or buy me a coffee. But before you do that, please check out the verified Ukrainian charities that we have listed in the description of the video. It's never been more important than it is now to make sure we help Ukraine stay resilient and resist Russian aggression. Welcome to the channel.
Lovely to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. I'm a big fan, by the way. Your channel
Oh,
is wonderful.
that's brilliant. Thanks so much. It's a strange journey. I think we've all been on in the last 2 years, but yeah, the channel is just coming up for its second birthday in April, and yeah, it's grown and gone places that I could never have anticipated. And of course, it led me to visit Ukraine for the first time in August last year. We were discussing just before we hit record there. But you've obviously been exposed to a lot more and for a lot longer in Ukraine. What led you to the country, the culture, and to remain there during the full-scale war?
Well, I'll begin by saying that I have a family origin story, which is part of my passion for the Ukrainian cause right now. It certainly isn't the only one. My great-grandfather is from Lviv, Ukraine. He was a Jew. He was hunted down by Russians who probably would have taken his life. And his fellow citizens of Lviv said, here's what we'll do. We'll hide you in a chimney. We'll give you enough money to escape and get to America on the condition that once you're successful, you'll send money back to bring 16 people from Ukraine to the United States. Well, he did that. And today I feel like I go back in part to pay the interest on that remarkable debt that Ukrainians brought to us. My background is my mother's side Irish Catholic, my father's side Russian Jew, which is an interesting combination, by the way. I think we may share some similar backgrounds there.
We do, we
And
do.
a fascinating combination. But beyond that, over the course of my life, I have been an opponent to Soviet imperialism and Soviet aggression. In my very early 20s, I was in Angola reporting on Soviet and Cuban incursions in sub-Saharan Africa. I was in Central America. And I am a lifelong opponent of the Soviet ideology, which I believe, if advanced, creates an existential threat to freedom in the world. I have profound concerns, maybe we'll dive into it today, about the polarization in the United States on the issue of Ukraine and what has happened philosophically to people who historically were anti-communist, anti-Marxist, and anti-Soviet, but have, for all practical purposes, adopted wholesale the philosophy of Vladimir Putin. It's really a frightening occurrence to me. I love the Ukrainian people. I live in a community where there are many Ukrainians and Russians, and I love my relationships with them. They're beautiful people. They're brilliant people, intelligent people, heartfelt people. They're aware of their history. They have something to teach the entire world. They are absolutely committed to freedom. I don't know that Americans fully get that. Ukrainians hate corruption, they love freedom, and they will not go quietly into the night.
And freedom, I mean, one thing that we've come to sort of crystallize on this channel is the idea that freedom isn't just an abstract concept. Freedom isn't just something you desire in and of itself, but it's something that is the enabling force of innovation, creativity. In fact, when you restrict freedom, you also restrict the ability to organize, to create new things, to bring new things into the world, and ultimately to generate wealth as well. I mean, the resistance to communism is quite clear. You know, that was highly restrictive of freedom and highly restrictive of the kind of innovations that we treasure. It's less clear, I think, to many people that the current incarnation of Russia, even if it lacks that coherent philosophy, is equally restrictive of freedom, innovation, and creativity. I mean, is that your sense too?
I think that's true, but I think it's very true that it's not clear to them. But here are some things that should be clear. The present leadership of Russia are the same people who are in leadership roles under the USSR. They are formerly trained Marxist-Leninist KGB agents who have technically shifted platforms. What is exactly the same is the Soviet ideology, the Soviet history, the Soviet view of the state and total authority, driving people, having rights around the world. That has not changed. The technical use of communism may not serve the benefit of Vladimir Putin right now, but totalitarianism does, dictatorship does, statism does, and neo-Soviet revival ideology absolutely does. And if you ask the question, what was America really fighting during the Reagan administration, during the Thatcher regime? What were they fighting over the last 60 years? Well, we tend to say communism, but it was actually Sovietism. It was the Soviet thinking, because that's what was spreading the ideology around the world. So from my perspective, the technical absence of communism doesn't say much. The presence of Soviet revival thinking was a threat, remains a threat, and creates an existential crisis for the world.
And of course, from your reporting in Angola and other places, you saw a clear injection of statism of the sort of Soviet, often would go with highly corrupt elites, dictatorial elites, and so on, which, Russia could then negotiate with, and in its mafia style, the sort of informal power relations that grease that system would work in that environment. They don't work in a rule of law environment. We'll talk about law and culture in a minute.
Right.
Now you've got Wagner spreading its tentacles throughout Africa. You've got a form of Russian informal relations, informal mafia-style relations being used as a tool of the state as well. But it doesn't seem to be resisted by, broadly speaking, the West in the same way that we resisted the encroachment of Soviet ideology.
Presently, we are experiencing in the West. I'm going to speak of America in particular because I think tremendous credit needs to go to Europe for having an element of clarity. I don't want to say perfectly so, but far better, I believe, than the United States as a whole. And here in the United States, we're suffering from historical amnesia. We've experienced a lot since 1945. And those are the lessons which define the modern world. They defined the rule of law, which was to govern the relationships of nations. When the average American thinks, hey, I'd like to go to Scotland on vacation, I'd like to go to Italy, I'll go over to Europe. They don't understand that this is only possible because of the defeat of Nazism, the establishment of the rule of law, the presence of NATO, the growth of international economies based on free market systems, imperfectly, granted, very imperfectly, but nonetheless, it's there. And they've forgotten that. And the reality is that with that historical amnesia, Putin has capitalized. Putin is very smart. He's intelligent. He's not just an idiot. He understands he's a diabolically evil man, but he's not a stupid man. And he's understood that within the West, he can capitalize on divisions within America. So he has essentially, back in 2019 and before, when he did his film with Oliver Stone, a pro-communist documentarian, his message was everything that's about to go down in Ukraine is the fault of the CIA, and it's the fault of the Biden administration. So consequently, that plays into the heart of people that don't like the Biden administration. I'm personally not a huge fan of the Biden administration, but I don't think the Biden administration is the reason why why Russia went into Ukraine. Although, they've made big errors, I don't want to deny that fact. And the consequence has been that many in America have forgotten the Soviet issue, forgotten the communist issue, and all they can think of is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that has turned the debate upside down into an emotional debate, an incoherent discussion based on anger rather than on facts.
And that is a classic Russian imperialist technique going back 400 years, or Muscovite, I would say, imperialist tactic. It's divide and conquer. You side with, one of your opponents against their opponents. When they've been attrited down, might take a generation, a couple of decades. You then flip and you side with somebody else. And essentially, it's a process where essentially you use your enemies to weaken themselves.
Okay.
I could inject that it's not just the US. Poland seems to be tearing itself apart with some degree of help. Again, Russia doesn't create these tensions, but it exacerbates them.
It certainly exploits them. It exploits
Mm,
them, and they found a tremendous wedge within Hungary, a tremendous wedge. They are building a wedge within Poland, and I'll tell you what, Poland, of all countries, Poland has done a lot of good things. They've been a real hero in this war. I'm deeply grateful for the Poles for what they've done. But what we see happening in Poland right now is frightening. We really have to be on the lookout for where those internal crises go. And until we recognize the tactics of this KGB operation, whether we're talking about the role of the KGB run church or the KGB run media or whatever it happens to be, until we get it, we're just going to be taken advantage of constantly.
and the church is an interesting one because let's cover that, because this seems to be an area which has especially provided cover for Putin. There are amongst the evangelical community in the US, typically, again, those are going to be voting. I don't want to completely label everybody, but it's more likely they'll be voting for GOP, and there will be sort of MAGA tendencies amongst that constituency as well. They seem to have been largely fooled by the idea that the Russian Orthodox Church represents value, morality, some kind of spirituality, when
Mhm.
in fact it's in its current form, it's the creation of the KGB under Stalin, and essentially there's a direct line of inheritance of its upper leadership to that and the sort of techniques that were developed at that point.
Completely accurate. I'd bring our listeners back on a little historical journey to the 1920s and 1930s, where Hitler presented himself as the leader of the moral community in Germany. He was going to clean out the brothels. He was going to shut down the clubs. He was going to urge people to go back to church, because for Germany to be a righteous nation, a successful nation, they had to be a moral nation. In America, members of the isolationist and what they then called America First community grabbed hold of that, and they said, look at Europe, it's going to pot. Look at America, it's going to pot. But Germany has a leader who is calling for moral prowess. We should honor Hitler. Well, what's history told us? He was one of the most depraved human beings in the history of the world. And that was a trick, which was very successful. Putin has done the very same thing. During the 80s and 90s, I was working with the underground church indirectly, supporting them in Russia. And the KGB was the source of the Russian Orthodox Church was a vehicle for executing Christians, sending them to Siberia, persecution, torture, etc. The present patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, is a KGB agent. He is in Putin's right hand. When I was interviewing people in Bucha and Irpin, I went into Armenian Orthodox churches, Eastern Catholic churches. I went in the Lavra to both sides, the Muscovite. I interviewed Jews. I interviewed evangelicals, Baptists, Assemblies of God, all different forms of Orthodox. Every person I interviewed outside the Moscow church said, well, it's not a church. It's an ecclesiastical military operation. And every one of them said, Ukraine is the most religiously free nation. I was working with a doctor who was Muslim, who moved to Ukraine for a number of reasons, but had never felt such religious freedom as he did find in Ukraine. So what's happened is the evangelical community in America has gotten its information from very untrustworthy sources, Vivek Ramaswamy, Tucker Carlson, who have given just directly straight off of RT, off Russia Today, Kremlin propaganda, and said the opposite of what's true. There are many evangelicals and conservatives that actually have very tender hearts to the cause of religious freedom. They're not bad people, they're good people, but they have ended up believing that somehow the Christians are being persecuted. Here's how Christians are being persecuted. Russian troops move into the east and they blow up 500 Baptist churches. They take Orthodox pastors that are outside the Moscow branch and they torture them in horrific ways. They go into Bucha and they try to identify the Orthodox and they try to take them out. Why is this so important? Well, when Patriarch Kirill told the soldiers, I bless you, we're going to bless the tanks. And not only that, but you will receive spiritual indemnification when you kill these Nazis in Ukraine. So you have these people going into Ukraine believing that they are working for the church to perform atrocities. This is the bizarre upside down world we live in, and Americans have been sold a bill of goods. What they've been told is the opposite of what's happening. I'd add one more thing. There's a powerful pro-Russian lobby in Congress, which is also communicating falsehood about the Russian Orthodox Church. By the way, I was outside the Lavra in Kyiv, and I interviewed a 22-year-old girl, comes out there every day with a sign with a picture of Putin and Patriarch Kirill. And it was the Russian Orthodox priest that basically beat the girl up. She walked over to the Lavra, they pushed her against the wall. These guys are thugs. And it is not, Americans need to study a little bit deeper. They've been given a false history of the Russian Orthodox Church, which was granted a form of authority by Constantinople about 400 years ago and then revoked. So even under their own branch of Christianity, they lack the jurisdictional authority to speak to Ukraine anymore. So that's done. It's really just a branch of the state.
And yeah, that's absolutely extraordinary. And of course, Peter the Great was the one that really first sort of had that synthesis of church and state and destroyed the sort of independence. And yeah, I mean, this is an element of the methodology is to turn institutions into zombie institutions, to deprive them of any kind of organic agency or whatever, and they become hollow, they become meaningless, and it's almost sort of ritualized, as it were. Two questions come out of this. One is the process you talk about here of people who are spreading the narratives, amplifying the narratives. They don't just pop up overnight. This must take sort of decades to seed these people into the system, to feed them narratives, which they may or may not believe. But this isn't an operation you can suddenly just click your fingers and create. This must be decades in the making. I mean, what do we know about that?
Well, we know that certainly for the 20 plus years that Putin has been in authority, he has established internal disinformation branches made up of thousands of individuals, incredibly highly funded. When you think about Russian bots and various things like that, that's just a microscopic element of the disinformation campaign, which has been coming out of Moscow. And of course, it's been coming out of Moscow for the better part of 100 years, because as important as their military is, their disinformation campaigns arguably are a more powerful weapon for global control. America, for whatever problems we have, which are legion, whatever problems we have, we don't have an organized, concerted effort run by small individuals. Now, there are some people on the right who think that's true, but just logically, if you think about it, there may be people trying to influence this. You may have general consensus in the media, but you have one individual running a multi-trillion-dollar state organization, which is actively involved in the destabilization of the world and spreading false information. But at a particular point in time, they reach the point where Americans will do the work for them. And because of the polarity in America, we have gone from being a civil, you and I are having a civil conversation. I'm not sure we would disagree on anything, but let's say we did disagree. That would be okay. We would talk about it with civility. Largely, that is absent in America today, which works to the benefit of Putin, because he can play upon the anger of one group against the other group. And frankly, there's been bad behavior on both sides in America. And that bad behavior has whooped up people on the right and the left into a mob frenzied mentality where reason is gone. So I worry very much about how we are manipulated, not by the mainstream media as much as we are by Moscow, though I often disagree with the mainstream media, often. But we need to have independence of thought and look at the facts. You know, Ukraine, arguably, is the most reported on war in the history of the world. No war in history has been reported live or in such depth. And you ask, well, how is this possible? Clearly, technology is a big part of it. You have 42 million people under siege using iPhones, recording their neighbors being destroyed. That's never been done before. Things are happening in real time. And yet, despite the fact that there is such coverage, I covered Bucha. I interviewed victims of Bucha. One of the founders of my organization, Ukraine Story, was a first responder at the very beginning of April into Bucha, tracking the Russian units that were engaged in the atrocities. And yet there are still people today that say, well, there's no evidence We just, Lavrov told us there's no evidence, so we just can't be sure. Maybe it's a false flag operation. If ever something was documented, it's Bucha. And there's no excuse except willing ignorance to deny these things. So when Mr. Carlson says to the world, you know nothing of what's happening, there's been no reporting at all, it's a fairy tale.
It's extraordinary that it works. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's turn to one of the topics comes out of that then, which is and this is an interesting one, which I kind of, haven't read a huge amount about it, but I'm sure there's, academic literature about it. And that is the interplay between law, culture, and morality. And, it's very difficult to explain this to people, the fundamental differences. We talk about Ukrainians being freedom loving, etc., and we try to put these labels on it. But, how does that actually work when it comes to law and legality? Because in your everyday life, most of us don't know what is written in law. Most of us have not memorized that, or we have vague awareness about what we can and can't do. And I think in a society with a highly developed sense of humanity, which clearly Ukraine does have, because it's trying not to waste its people, it's not using its people as resources, a normal human being may well say, okay, I think this is lawful or lawless, but let's also consult my internal check of morality. Is this right? Is it wrong? Does it feel right? Does it feel right? Etc. There's this internal dialogue that goes on. No, I don't know the evolutionary process whereby that came about. Maybe it's through hundreds of years of European evolution and history and going through various revolutions, quite possibly. But it seems on a very broad level that there are many Russians, certainly in the army, that do not have this. And it's less about law, it's more about orders, right? If I have an order, I ask myself, is this allowed by the order or is it not? And if it's allowed, it's not a question of it being moral or immoral. It's allowed or it isn't. So I don't know how these things evolve. I know as someone who's sort of studied law and is invested in morality, I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Wow, it's a big subject. And it's actually maybe the most important subject in some respects. In 1775, the year before America signed the Declaration of Independence, the #1 most popular, most widely read book in North America was Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. And chapter 1 of Blackstone's commentary, he begins by saying that while civilization will develop and expand upon the common law, in the end, all true laws derive from transcendent truth. It's wrong to kill. It's wrong to steal. The sort of things you see in the Ten Commandments, which both Jews and Christians recognize, so that there is a transcendence there. One of the things, you and I both visited Scotland, and I'm a big fan of Scotland. You're a graduate from Edinburgh. I spent some time on the Isle of Iona, and there was a famous leader there back in the 7th century by the name of Columba, who played a big role in converting the Picts and the Goths and the various tribes. He had a student whose name was Adumna, who wrote a book called The Law of the Innocents. And the Law of the Innocents said that in our new civilization, we have to follow a transcendent principle, which is you don't kill children and you don't kill women. You only kill combatants in war. And so this idea of what constitutes just war theory, for example, has been at the heart and soul of Western civilization. I'm not saying we followed it all the time. I'm not saying we've executed it, but that there has been this idea that you can't just kill people. You can't just invade. There must be a just cause, and that just cause derives from certain transcendent principles. Now, that's been debated from Augustine to the present, but largely, especially after 1945, when we were doing the Geneva Conventions, at this follow-ups on it, there was agreement that in our new world, the post-World War II world, we would accept the role of transcendent concepts of what's right and wrong that would filter down and impact the way we act as nations. Russia does not subscribe to that at all. It is what is right to the state. And so if you grew up in Russian society, there is not a transcendent right. It's statism. It's the state is the God. The state is that which is transcendent. The state dictates morality. It doesn't come from the Bible or the Ten Commandments or the Quran or anything. It comes from the state. And you have a generation of people that have grown up that way. And yet, here's what I find so interesting. We meaning various filmmakers, have captured recordings of Russians in Bucha and elsewhere, calling their mothers and saying, I shot a bunch of children. I shot them on the street. And the mother saying, good, they're Nazis. They should die. And the kids saying, but I know, but it doesn't feel right. So I'm drinking a lot of alcohol just so I can make it easier to do it. And I guess that brings back to a concept, which is, and this is my view, which relates to my fundamental understanding of God and transcendence, and that is that there is a conscience that people of every civilization have. It can be suppressed, it can be attacked, but at the end of the day, we know it is wrong to just murder people. And unfortunately, the state in Russia does not recognize that. They come from Soviet background, so they inherently reject that. And their only use of Christianity or of any form of religion is as a vehicle of the state. Now, on this line, Ukrainians are so on target, because even though they have emerged from the Soviet control, they have a history that predates the Soviet Union. And let's not forget, Ukraine was an independent country for 3 years before the Soviets came back in and took it over, but they go back hundreds of years. They go back a millennium, and infused into that culture is various forms of Christian faith, which say you shouldn't kill, you shouldn't rape, you shouldn't steal. And that's still part of the conscience. Maybe you remember during the beginning of the war, Zelenskyy was putting out notes which said, I'm writing to the mothers of Russia. How can you allow your children to do this? How is it possible? And this is where Americans, I think, really don't understand the Soviet mentality. They really don't care. The leadership doesn't care, which is why the way they treat their own soldiers is barbaric. It's simply barbaric.
And as someone who's been interested in literature, and in fact, there's a connection between what I studied in English literature, deconstructing text, looking at the minutiae of language to hyperanalyze, all the intent and meaning, then studying Russian, and now my job in digital marketing is to deconstruct language so you can build it back up again to influence people and their behaviors, which helps in the understanding of propaganda. And that's why I'm fascinated by that as well. So I started listening very, very closely to speeches. Dare I say, I loosely give the term speech to the stuff that Trump says. More of a word salad, but there's a form of method in the madness there, and he's testing different ideas out. But I also listen and very closely parse the speeches and this, what's coming out of the propagandists, because it's not just a load of sort of toxic, hateful stuff. It's not just, George Orwell, hate hour, get some rage, etc. There are there's very specific narratives there that are designed to make people, allow them to dehumanize others, and to give them the narrative forms that then will absolve themselves of entirely dehumanized behaviors, which is why I think the propagandists need to stand trial in future genocidal trials, because there's a mechanism there, and they're absolutely consciously a part of the genocidal machine. But I'm coming not from a position of someone of faith, but how should we communicate this to people who still don't quite kind of get that?
I actually think you are on, for me, what is one of the most frightening and fascinating subjects. It's a lifetime fascination to me. How do you get ordinary people to perform extraordinarily inhuman acts? And it's the process of dehumanization, which you've talked about. It is the building up of a mob in such a manner that when all is said and done, you no longer view your opponent as a human, but as a monster. Because if somebody is a monster, there's no need for due process. There's no need for legitimate fact checking. They're a monster. Monsters can be abused. Monsters can be destroyed. Monsters can be killed. The soldiers that I mentioned Bucha a couple of times, because I just think it's like you mentioned Auschwitz, and people realize what happened there. Bucha is just it's one of many examples, but it's a place where I went. And in Bucha, when the soldiers arrived, they would bang on the doors and say, "Where are the Nazis? Where are the Nazis?" Why? Because Putin was able to develop this narrative, which is, you are our emissaries to rid the world of Nazism, which is, to a Russian, under the present narrative, the greatest evil on planet Earth. Rules don't apply to Nazis or their children. And so they would just use kids as target practice. They would use the elderly as target practice. They were all Nazis. And once you're a Nazi, there are no rules that need to apply whatsoever. Now, here in America, the narrative has developed in different ways. And what the propagandists in America have done is, first of all, they take the headlines from Russia, Kremlin propaganda, and they just spit it out there as if it's fact, sending confusion through the ranks. So they use false information, a false perspective right at the very beginning, and then they use contempt. Contempt is the most powerful tool to win over an audience for acts of cruelty. If you can mock Zelenskyy relentlessly, make fun of his face, make fun of the clothing he wears, pull up pictures of him dancing from who knows when he was an actor back in the olden days, and just build a sense of contempt. This is what Hitler did in the 1930s. This is always strategically a great way to neutralize the conscience of individuals, because they just think, this person is contemptuous. He's disgusting. I don't want to have anything to do with them. So false information, contempt, and the process of transforming them into monsters, dehumanizing. This is how you get concentration camps. It's how you have people justifying the Russian invasion. And it has happened at length. And many of our leaders have done it. Many of the leaders in American media on the right, because the cause to them, they don't care about Ukraine. The cause to them is fighting Biden. And they view the two as the same. By the way, just as an aside, I think Biden has botched Ukraine by not providing them with necessary weapons, by not taking a stronger position. There is an argument to be made that it is immoral to prolong a war when you can finish a war. And if you look at American history, the debate between Douglas MacArthur and Harry Truman was, are we going to finish this or not? Truman said no. MacArthur was out. So I personally disagree. My two things that I really have trouble with is, I do not believe in waging war on civilians in any form. I think it is one of the ultimate crimes. And I do not believe in waging wars that you do not intend to win. So both of those have been problems. So there's criticism to go around on both sides, of course. But in America, it is just partisan. And because it's partisan, they've dehumanized Ukrainians. It's tragic. And one of the goals of my film projects is to humanize the Ukrainian people. That's what I love to do, because they are amongst the most beautiful, heartfelt, passionate, just wonderful people. And it's why when guys like you and I go to Ukraine, we want to keep going back to Ukraine. We think, wow, that was great.
There's something there, isn't there? There's something there. And I only recently
Yes.
put my finger on it, which is, again, we talk about Maidan and the extraordinary explosion of political awakening that came through that. But I also realized there's something else there, which is a humility, which you tend to only get in people who have been colonized rather than the colonizers. But there is an extraordinary humility to Ukrainians en masse as individuals, um, which you tend not to get, unfortunately, en masse. And this is a big generalization with Russians. You tend to get some, even amongst people who loathe Putin and so on, you will quite often get a sort of, it's almost an emotion. It's a sense of exceptionalism. It's a sense of uniqueness. It's a sense of I'd almost call it imperial swagger. I mean, we know this because, let's be frank, there's quite a lot of that in England. There's quite a lot of that in the US. There's quite a lot of that in all countries which were formerly, great imperial powers. It's an afterglow of that kind of confidence that it provides, but it's also something that can suck the oxygen out of the room. It can put colonized people into a shadow and not realize it's doing that.
Surely there is a way for us to be deeply, deeply grateful for our countries, our own countries, with a recognition of our weaknesses and our strengths, and to have a confidence and a gratitude while maintaining a humility which allows us to learn from and appreciate from the other nations of the world. As a documentarian, I've traveled to probably close to 35 countries, shot in many of them. My greatest instructors have been meeting people from around the world and learning from them. I come with some very strong opinions. I am a man of faith. I do have strong opinions on things. I benefit enormously, enormously from people who are very, very different. Americans used to be more of that way. I think we are less so today because of our own internal strivings. Ukrainians are grateful. All the Ukrainians I meet are grateful. There's something else. Here's a word we don't hear very much anymore. They are noble. There's a nobility to their purpose. There's a nobility to their action. There's a self-sacrificing nature. I've interviewed many, and I've seen this nobility over and over again. I see defiance against evil. I see so many of them have a faith. You'll talk to them and they'll say, I just believe God will be with us. It may be a general faith or a vague faith, but they have a fundamental faith. I would say they have a unity which we don't see anywhere else in the world. We haven't seen this unity since 1945. And there's something for us to learn. It's been lost in the ephemera of the American conscience. And I believe I think we're missing something. We can be instructed by the people of Ukraine, both in the heart and the head.
Let's get back to the propaganda, because we talk about monsters, and that's absolutely there, and we see the malign impact of that. But there's something else there. To create monsters, you have to create the impression of angels as well. You have to create, even if it's pure artifice or nonsense or utterly mystical, you also have to create some purity, because the monsters are spoiling that. The only way between you and paradise or utopia or perfection or cleanliness or whatever it happens to be, is these dirty things over here. And as soon as we get that out of the way, so that's maybe the link with idealistic communism. That's also the link, unfortunately, with German fascism.
Yes, and in this case, the angel, every time Putin gets on, as he did yesterday, where he declared Belgium to be a construct of the Russian creation, when when Putin acts as historian, what he's really trying to do is to build a legacy of angels. What he's trying to say to the world is, we have been set apart for greatness. We have been the beneficiary of the world. We have been the people that have helped to bring everyone together under the Russian banner. We are a good people. We are the people who single-handedly defeated Nazism, just us, forget the Allies. We are that people. And so if you were empowered with sort of a sense of spiritual, intellectual, and nationalistic zeal that you are the righteous ones, you know what it is? It's holy war. Putin has created a holy war. And the holy war is the God is the state, and the avenging angels are his troops in Ukraine.
And of course, the challenge here, and this is one of the narratives we get, unfortunately, still in the media, is it's Putin's war. Russians wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for Putin. I mean, quite possibly there wouldn't be a war if it wasn't for some of Putin's paranoia, obsessions, and so on. But it's also true that if he was victorious, as he was victorious in taking Crimea, you won't find anybody in Russia, apart from, 0.0001% of voices who will say, hang on a second, we might have won, but it's wrong. There weren't too many of those. Even, dare I say it, even Nemtsov, Navalny, and others were saying, well, you know what? Yeah, it's wrong, but it's happened. So, if you go back and look at the sort of speeches they made, there's that total lack of moral clarity. The majority of Russians absolutely applaud it. And people say, okay, it's because it's Crimea and it's because it's majority Russian. Well, that's just a fairy story as well. That is just another narrative to get you to swallow that pill. It ignores the reality of the expelled Tatars. It ignores many Ukrainians who fled that territory or were captured, tortured, etc. It's another fantasy story. And unfortunately, If Putin had prevailed with a slightly smarter strategy, maybe punching down in the south, taking Moldova, if he'd succeeded, how many Russians would be against the war? Uh,
Few,
very few
very
indeed.
few.
If he takes Poland, if he takes Romania, and he's successful in doing that, how many would object? Well,
You're
very few.
what you're pointing out is basically might makes right. If we are successful, that proves that we are in fact right. So when we win, it proves that we are right. And of course, we will deny that we ever lost, but we will assert that we always win because we can never be defeated. And that proves that we're right. So in my nation of the United States, when I was a little boy, I was taught might does not make right, and that you have to acknowledge your errors. Today, within the anti-Ukrainian branch of the debate in American politics, and it's complicated layers to that debate, by the way. It's not as simple as I think a lot of people recognize, but within that, there is this idea. You heard Vivek Ramaswamy say it point blank. Look, they've been there for 10 years, end of subject, let them keep it. And most Americans that are not vested with an interest in it, they think, well, okay, that makes sense. But in fact, it makes no sense whatsoever. And if you talk to a Crimean, as I have, numerous Crimeans, their heart is broken. They can't go home today because their land is infested with these Soviets under a Russian flag.
And it's interesting. I got this sense, in the 90s, visiting Karelia, which of course was a part of Finland. It was taken. I mean, Finland fought heroically, but had to surrender territory, including its third largest city. And Karelia now is just, it's a weekend destination for Russians in the summer with dachas and so on. And, what was a vibrant city there, Viborg, is now little more than a village, basically, in terms of atmosphere, in terms of the sort of level
Yep.
of culture and so on you see there. And that struck me incredibly forcefully at the time, and I actually talked to people like, this is Finnish territory, and they're like, so, it's mine now. And
Yeah.
there's no sense whatsoever that of any sort of morality or any sense of being sort of uncomfortable or caring. It's colonialism in its absolutely purest form, which is, if I can take it and I can hold it, that's mine. That's it.
I think there is a point that needs to be emphasized. And the point is that we have a line in the sand, historically speaking. And the line in the sand is 1991. And it's not a small matter, it's a big matter. Because there have been all sorts of shifts and political intrigues and battles and wars that have shifted the geography of various nations. But in 1991, an agreement was made, not just with Ukraine, but with other nations. And the entire world rested on the confidence of that. So people that infringe upon 1991 and the agreements that are made are terrorists to the world. They are threats to the modern order. So in 1991, it doesn't matter. Putin can construct whatever fantasy historical narrative he would like to. Boris Yeltsin sat at a table with Ukrainian leaders, and Ukraine became an independent nation, and it wasn't the only one that did so. So all of that history is completely irrelevant as to the question of Ukraine. But whatever happened after 1991 in Georgia, that could happen in Moldova, that's happening in Ukraine, must be evaluated in terms of morality and what is right and what is wrong, because we have agreed that these are the boundaries that we're going to live by. We don't want to go back to the old world of chaos where people just murder people and boundaries are constantly changing. And just because you have the might, therefore you have the right. We've rejected that. That is a form of thinking and of anti-law, which the world has said we cannot coexist in that kind of a reality.
And it goes back to an era before the New Testament of the Bible. It goes back to an era, dare I say, of the Bronze Age, where you get these stories of armies sweeping in, taking something. A few years later, someone else sweeps in, takes it back. You don't get that sense of embedded morality, as you say. Now we're facing a crucial period. I mean, this is probably the last sort of area we'll talk about in this one, but I want to have many more conversations here because I think this is a almost limitless well of discussion. But we've got the US election coming up. We've got the prospect of Donald Trump now having a face-off with Biden. We have two forms of threat there. I mean, Biden is maybe the least worst option for Ukraine, but as you say, not the best necessarily, because of the inherent weakness of strategy or even lack of strategy about the end game in Ukraine and the drip feed and the general weakness of the idea that prolonging the war was a good idea as opposed to ending it swiftly and sharply, which would, I believe, have been possible in 2022 with the correct munitions and the correct support. What are we faced here? I mean, either we have an extended attritional war, perhaps under Biden, carrying on the same strategy, or with Trump, we have potentially exit from NATO and a total abandonment of Ukraine by the US, with Europe having to face up to, I would say, its responsibilities with the crutch perhaps of the US removed. Where are we going with this? And given the divisions we're seeing in Slovakia, Serbia, Hungary, and now Poland, being very much, in my view, the subject of active measures, which are on some level succeeding, what kind of world are we heading into?
2024 is 1939. And the same issues that divided the world and that faced the world in 1939 is where we are today. You could argue it's 1940. You could argue it's 1941. But it's basically that time period. We need to realize that. The issues of Russian invasion has already taken place. The stated goals of moving forward, Russia's constantly talking about moving forward. The disinformation campaigns, the divisions within the US, we're paralleling what our grandfathers experienced. We need to learn from their mistakes. Presently, we're not. We're repeating them and amplifying them, actually. So presently, our issue with the presidency is also connected to the House of Representatives and the Senate in the United States. So even if a president holds to a particular view, he needs to have the backing of both houses to fully implement it properly. In America, funding other nations at war is considered discretionary, whereas there are other non-discretionary measures, and there needs to be agreement. And I'd say that at the moment, you have a majority of people in the House and in the Senate, both of whom support helping Ukraine, although I'm not sure that they have a vision of victory. They certainly have a vision of sustenance, and that would be Democrats and Republicans. That doesn't mean that all Republicans are that way. Very much not true. There's a branch which is opposed to it. What about our presidency? Well, even if President Biden were to be reelected and wanted to stand with Ukraine, if he doesn't have support within the Congress, it's going to be a problem long term, even if it's just a maintenance position. What about President Trump? I'm going to offer you a perspective which is a little bit unorthodox. What motivates Donald Trump? Is Donald Trump committed to Putin? Is he committed to crushing Ukraine? I actually don't think so. I think he's committed to himself. And the question that's going to come up is, what will be the influences? What will be the factors that influence President Trump? Putin actually got it right. He said he would rather have Biden, who is predictable, than Donald Trump, who is not predictable. And I can see, this is going to surprise a lot of our listeners, but if past is prologue, a circumstance could arise where Trump says, here's what we're doing, and everybody follows him because that's what they're doing. Or he could say, we're going over there, and everybody goes over there. If you actually listen to what he said over the last 2 years regarding Ukraine, at the beginning of the war, he said, here's what I would do. Number one, he said, if I were president, Putin wouldn't have invaded. May or may not be true. He said, number two is I would give them better weapons and more weapons. He said at the very beginning. Now, he changed that later, and then he changed it again. So I think you cannot underestimate the influence of the emotional and personal nature of Trump wants to be a hero. You know, he did it in North Korea, thinks he can do it here. I don't think anybody takes seriously the idea that 24 hours of sitting down between Putin and Zelenskyy is going to bring an end to the war. That's insanity, actually. The only way you reach that conclusion is if you force Ukraine to lose the war by giving up property that belongs to it, which means long-term war with Russia and continual aggression by Russia. So the only kind of victory, which is a real victory, is get rid of the Russians, return the land. That's it. But you cannot underestimate the unpredictability of President Trump. You just can't. Which brings me to another point. If the mission is to stop World War III, if the mission is to maintain the Western order at some level and to prevent a total breakdown and conflict with this Soviet revival flaw, if that's the mission, if the mission is to help Ukraine, then whoever becomes president, we need to adopt a posture of influence and diplomacy. And it will not be enough to hate this person or hate that person. We need to get past the hatred. It doesn't matter how irritated you are by this guy or by that guy. We need to think in terms of the greater good. We need to think rationally in terms of the objective. And I think it's going to take a little bit for people on both sides of the aisle to reach that point. For my part as a filmmaker, I want to think in terms of the principle and of the issues, less about the partisanship, and to be a force of persuasion. That's my personal objective.
That's extraordinarily important, and there are a few people, very few, unfortunately, who are doing that. But as you say, they're not coming with preconceived ideas. They're simply trying to take communities who currently may not support Ukraine and thinking, how can we get the truth to these people? How can we dispel some of these toxic manufactured narratives that they're currently being fed? So as you say, it's about who's influencing them. How can we gently insert ourselves into that pool of influence? Not an easy task, but as you say, it won't be conducted by screaming at each other.
Absolutely not. I pray for a day when we can become a civil society again, and we can sit down with people of very different views and have rational, kind, thoughtful conversations that are driven around reason as opposed to hatred and screaming. If we don't change that, that's actually my biggest concern about politics today. I have deep concerns about the policies. Obviously, I disagree with many things that are happening, but more fundamental than that, if we lose our humanity one towards another, if we justify indecent, barbaric verbal behavior as well as physical behavior, there is no hope. We have to be able to have a civil society. We have to be able to speak with kindness and with charity, and even to listen to people with whom we disagree.
And that perhaps is the message for Ukraine, maybe the subject of our next conversation, and that is Ukraine's ability to set aside partisan, left-right, atheist, believing beliefs, and just say, okay, these are not going to divide us, right? We're going to find something that actually we hold in common, even if we fundamentally disagree about the structure of society, politics, and so on. There's something bigger than that, and I think that's maybe something to launch our next conversation.
I would love to. I've spoken to many individuals on this precise issue, people who have very heartfelt opinions. I don't agree with Zelenskyy. I like Zelenskyy. I don't agree with it. But there's one thing they all say: right now, we stand together as a people, period. We must drive out the invader. And it's a sad thing. Maybe it's a good thing sometimes that it takes a level 1 crisis for people to realize there are more important things than their petty squabbles. There are bigger issues at stake. And as we look at Ukraine today from Great Britain, Scotland, and the United States of America, we would do well to realize the choices we make now will define the next 50 years of world history.
What a great place to end. Douglas, thank you so much for coming onto the channel. I look forward to the next chance to speak, and I very much look forward to looking at your materials, sharing them with the audience, and helping to increase the awareness of those. Thank you so much.
Blessings. Have a great day. Thank you.